Hey folks, I am Steve, one of the owners of Scuppernong Books here in Greensboro, North Carolina, and want to thank you for being here for this edition, actually, because it's a series now of what writers get wrong about. Previously, we have done a Zoom on what writers get wrong about women. And a couple of weeks ago, we did one on what writers get wrong about LGBTQ. And we recorded both of those, and they're on our YouTube channel, the Scuppernong Books YouTube channel. So if you're interested, you can check them out there. We're going to be recording the one tonight as well. And in a couple of days, it will appear on the YouTube channel. So if you're excited about it and want to share it with other people, it will be there for other folks to see. I'm excited about who we have tonight, and I'm going to be posting, before I get to that, I'll just say that I'm going to be posting links to the books that these folks mention as they go along, so you can kind of check them out. If they mention a book that they particularly like or particularly, excited by, then I will post a link for it in the chat. We're going to be asking that you save questions and comments until after the conversation. But if you think of a question and you want to get it out, write it down in the chat there and send it off, and we will get to it just as soon as we get to the question and answer part. Sometimes it's easier to write them down as you think of them than to wait. So feel free to put questions and comments in the chat, and we will respond to those afterwards. And that's it. I'm going to tell you about the people who are coming, and then I'm just going to throw it open to them, and we'll have a conversation and then questions and comments at the end. Jameela Dallis writes for a range of audiences and industries. She's been a visiting assistant professor of English at Elon University and UNC Greensboro, and she's published in North Carolina's Indie Week, Decoded, a Duke Performances Journal, and Our State Magazine. She received her PhD in English from UNC Chapel Hill. Sorry, admitting another person. Gale Greenlee is a Greensboro native, a kid's book junkie, as I can attest, and the Emerging Voices Fellow at Ohio State University. She holds a doctorate in African American literature from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and her work focuses on representations of Blacks and Latinx girlhoods in kids and YA literature. She's currently writing her first children's book while taking periodic breaks to watch Girlfriends on Netflix. Don Holmes is a PhD candidate in rhetoric, composition, and literacy at UNC Chapel Hill, originally from Progress, Mississippi? Yes. He teaches rhetoric and composition at UNC and works as a writing coach at the UNC Writing Center. Don's research focuses on the early Black experience during the American colonial and early national moments. His dissertation explores Black rhetoric as an evolving tradition that explicates the United States' continual moral decay from 1723 to 1808. He avidly loves all things futuristic science fiction, especially Star Trek, and his nerd alert rings high when peering up at the night sky. He's also a long distance runner, and he loves to read contemporary retelling of history and literature, and has been a budding short story writer for years. So thank you for coming, Don, Gale, and Jameela, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve, so much for those introductions. Thank you, Jameela and Don, for joining me. As Steve said, I'm Gale, and the only thing that I'll add to those introductions is that Jameela, Don, and I all met in grad school at UNC Chapel Hill. Jameela and I came in at the same time, though she finished before I did. And Don, we were told a couple of days ago, was actually a college freshman, first-year student when we entered our PhD program. So we were feeling kind of old and, a little in our feelings about that. But I'm glad that y'all are here because we really have not been in the same space physically in a really long time. And we really haven't talked about books. And I know we all love books and love writing, good writing. So I'm just going to pop it off with the first question. What is the first book you read that had Black characters? Do you remember what it was and how you felt when you encountered those characters?
I can start. No, I do not remember what was the first book I read that had Black characters in it. And I think that really pains me, you know.
Mm.
And part of me believes that I had to I had to have read some book by some Black person or with some Black characters in it whilst in high school. But for the life of me, I can't remember. And perhaps because it was the way it was taught, it wasn't, you know, taught in a way that was exciting or interesting. And so that particular memory has gone out of my mind. And I feel like something is missing when it comes to that. But I will pivot though and say to you, the first time I read Phyllis Wheatley's work, I remember that like it was yesterday because it completely changed my life. You know, thought that I was going to um, read Langston Hughes poems all the time and be captivated. But I met this interesting person who, you know, next thing you know, is sent my life in an entirely different direction. But as far as first time ever, I don't remember.
But I'm wondering, Don, was that in college or was that in high school when you met Wheatley?
Oh gosh, that was definitely in college. I didn't even know Phyllis Wheatley and many of these other earlier people. For those of you who don't know, Wheatley is of course writing in the 18th century, and so many of these people who lived and exist, I had no idea that they were even, you know, people, you know, until I got to college, and that vastly changed my life as well. Yeah.
Okay. Jameela?
Yeah, I can't really remember. I was joking earlier and I said the Bible. Um, but,
Which leads us into a whole nother conversation.
thanks, Mom. No, but you know, so I went to a school that was fairly, you know, mixed and progressive. I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I didn't say where I came from. And I know we did units about Black history, and I know, you know, we learned about the history of enslavement. And so I want to say it's likely we probably read poetry. I feel like that was probably one of the more accessible things that we probably did. I'm guessing we probably read some Langston Hughes and Phyllis Wheatley. And you know, probably early on, but we probably didn't really, you know, talk about it in a way that gave it the texture and context that I got in grad school. But I want to say that I was exposed to literature by Black folks as a child early. And I was thinking about some of my favorite books as a kid. And a lot of them had to do with like animals and nature. Like Make Way for Ducklings was one of my favorite books. The Giving Tree, Bridge to Terabithia. I think some people died. Or the tree died. I don't know what happened. I can't remember. But that probably kind of set me up for, I remember I would read these books and like compete with this little guy that I had a crush on, and we would sit underneath the table in second and third grade and just read a bunch of books and I like, you know, the Scholastic Book Fair, that kind of thing. And we would buy all these books and read them and have a little race. And I remember reading a bunch of those scary stories to like, you know, tell in the dark. My dissertation was on Gothic lit, but yeah, like I want to say it was early, but I don't really have distinct memories. But I do remember that my mom, she insisted that I watched the biography of Miss Jane Pittman and Sounder. Like as a young child, I remember I had to watch those movies multiple times, and I don't think that like I understood why. Go ahead, sorry.
That's a throwback. Oh my gosh, I haven't thought about either one of those in a very, very long time. And it's interesting, Jameela, that you said, you know, that you were introduced to Black authors and writers through adults in your life, or, you know, other Black people, because I'm thinking about my dad was an avid reader and had like the autobiography of Malcolm X in the house, Black Rage. I mean, just all of these different things. And we were constantly talking about Black history, Black people, civil rights, racism, all of that. But I wasn't reading fiction. I wasn't reading stories about us. And actually, Don, what you were saying really resonated with me, because I don't remember reading any Black writers in high school. And I'm from Greensboro and attended the historically Black high school in town, James B. Dudley. I see one of my classmates on here, shout out. I don't remember any of that. And I want to say that actually the first time I read a book that featured Black people, or that talked in any significant way about Black people, it was in college, winter break, my first year, and it was Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism by Bell Hooks. And I picked that book up intentionally on my own. It wasn't assigned as a class, for a class, and I read it during the break. And that was my first kind of connection to seeing Black people in any shape and form in writing. Like, we were not reading Morrison at that point in high school. We weren't reading Maya Angelou. We weren't reading Alice Walker, Margaret Walker, you know, I don't even remember us reading Langston Hughes.
You know, I was thinking that we had to read Frederick Douglass's narrative in high school, right? But I just don't remember if we did. I remember specific texts from high school, like the Scarlet Letter. We read all of, you know, the Shakespeare poems in 12th grade. It was like British English or something, literature. We read Of Mice and Men. We've read Silas Marner, right? I remember these texts. We read Great Expectations.
Where did you go to school? Mississippi? That's what you said?
Yeah.
And you're younger than me. That's just crazy, because I went, you know, I grew up in Chattanooga, and I remember, I mean, I read A Lesson Before Dying, like in 9th, 10th grade or something, you know? We read Black people where I went to school, for sure. I just can't remember how early. That's so interesting.
Jameela, the movies, Jane Pittman and Sounder, we did watch, I remember in high school, Their Eyes Were Watching God with Ruby Dee and Halle Berry. Remember that version?
Oh my goodness.
Isn't it Ruby Dee and Halle Berry in it, right?
I think Halle Berry in it.
Wait a minute. Wait. You said you saw that movie when?
In high school, I remember.
I was like a full-ass adult when that movie came out.
Somebody will have to Google it and give us a date check.
Maybe it was post-high school. Maybe I'm, you know, putting together memories that, you know, aren't connected because of the lack of memory when it comes to these actual, you know, having read Black people.
I am looking at the chat, y'all, and someone in the chat, another UNC person said, great question. I'm thinking of high school, and it was, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, Maya Angelou, or Their Eyes Were Watching God, Zora Neale Hurston. That was required reading in the 11th grade English class. And she also asked, but didn't the Babysitters Club have a Black member? I don't remember. I didn't really read the Babysitters Club.
Oh, I watched all those movies. I can't remember if I read the books though. But I did watch those Babysitter Club movies. And oh, that makes me think of American Girl. I remember, you know, really wanting to get Addie, but too much money. But I feel like maybe I was older. I was maybe a little bit older, and dolls were like kind of behind.
But were you reading the story too as well?
Say what?
Were you reading the story in the American Girl series as well?
No, but I knew about them because I had friends that had the dolls and all the stuff. And it's funny because I mean I know that the friends that I had that had all those dolls, they were white, you know, and I just remember my parents just being like, yeah, that's too much money.
Well, let me ask y'all this. So why do you think representation matters? And I know that I'm asking two people who are, you know, trained to think about literature and who are talking to young people about literature all the time, but really not just as an academic, but as someone who writes creatively and someone who's also enjoys reading. Like, why do you think representation of Blackness and Black people, wide representations of us, are important?
Because we're a complex group of people, just like any other group of people. You know, not all of us grew up going to Baptist church. Not all of us grew up in the South. You know, not all of us grew up in, quote, you know, traditional hetero families. I mean, we're all different, right? And so there needs to be representation for all the different types of people we are. Because I know that for me, as like, you know, a little goth kid, I felt very different, you know, in terms of like with Black peers. A lot of my friends growing up were white, and I got picked on and stuff because of my interest. And so I think that like knowing that, yes, like it's okay to be a Black kid who loves horror, or it's okay to be a Black kid who, you know, listens to country music or whatever. Like we need to see those stories about ourselves. And we also need to see literature from more than just, you know, poets and people who are giving speeches like, you know, Douglas. We need to be reading fiction as kids.
Yeah, I co-sign that, but I would also add, for me, Gail, that importance is so useful when thinking about the historical roadmap that we've traveled, not only as a people, but as you know, as a nation and as the world. I think that we don't, the best way to understand history is by reading what people actually wrote about their lives and about their experiences and about the experiences of other people around them. And so, as Jameela is saying, when you read Frank J. Webb's The Garys and Their Friend, I know I'm calling out an old text now, but what you get from the book, for instance, it's a 19th century text that talks about, it has passing in it, it talks about, you know, racial caste, you know, the aftermath of slavery, etc. Many different conversations, but to not know that a text like that exists and to not know that the experiences that the text calls into question exist it's problematic in my view. So for me, it's about adding to the historical roadmap when you know, see these different types of representations, because if not, they're going to always be invisible and they get to live in the literature. You know, that's why we say always write in the present tense. You know what I mean? It's always, yeah.
Well, I'm thinking about representation and thinking about who's telling the story. I don't know, Jameela, if you remember that. Oh gosh, is it Eudora Welty, the essay "Where's the Voice Coming From"? I'm not sure if it's Welty or not, but
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, and Minrose used to love it. A professor that we had at UNC and specialist in Southern literature. So I'm thinking about this idea about where the story is coming from, who's telling the story, and how you feel about representations of Black people that are written by non-Black writers. And y'all know I love kids and young adult literature, and in YA circles in particular, in kids book circles in particular, there's been the whole "we need diverse book" movement, and then more recently the hashtag "own voices." And the idea is that if you're telling a story about somebody who has a quote unquote diverse identity, who is from perhaps a marginalized culture, then you need to be a part of that same community in order to tell that story justly, right? So I'm curious how you feel about that.
About other non-Black people telling stories about Black people?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I see your wheels are turning there, Don, so you can tell me to be quiet. But I brought some Flannery O'Connor to this. I enjoy O'Connor, and I've taught O'Connor many times. Two of the favorite stories that I teach, Everything That Rises Must Converge, which is the title of the collection that Everything That Rises Must Converge comes from. And then the other one is Revelation. And Everything That Rises Must Converge. Can I just read a couple of these little spots? Is that okay?
Go for it.
Okay. And so, and Everything That Rises Must Converge, there's a mom and a son. The son, his name is Julian, and he thinks himself kind of a progressive, you know, sort of young man. And his mom definitely represents, you know, the time before. Let's say that this is probably like in the 60s or something, and all of this takes place for the most part on a bus. And Julian, this character, okay, let's see. Oh gosh, I marked it out. Now I feel silly. Go ahead, Dawn, talk. I'm gonna find it again.
Hey, let me add, I have taught Everything That Rises Must Converge every semester since I've been teaching, except this semester, because I started transitioning her out for Morrison's short story Recessitive, right?
Oh, okay.
But Gail, to your question, I think that anyone can write about experiences that are their own, right? Of course, but I think that you can also write about experiences that are adjacent to yours. I mean, to write a book that doesn't have a Black character in it and you are setting it in New York City, for instance, would be a problematic book, right? I think what the writer does with those particular characters, are they more than just the slapstick person to come in and give you a piece of comedy, or they're going to say something sassy? What, you know, how are they presented? Is it this full-figured individual that shows, like what Jameela was saying earlier, a level of complexity, you know, even if they're only in it for like a few moments, kind of like what Jameela is going towards with the Black lady in this short story and her son, right? Is that what you were going for, Jameela?
Well, yeah, and actually you talking about that, I totally flashed back to grad school. And because I remember I kept this little journal about the magical Negro and how there's so many texts that we read where the one Black character in the book was this magical being that, you know, was holding all of this, you know, I don't know, like the power of transformation, the power of reckoning.
Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that more, Jameela? Because you saying that makes me think about Morrison and Morrison's
Playing in the Dark
essay. Well, not just Playing in the Dark, but Morrison's essay Rootedness.
The Ancestors Foundation.
Right? And this idea that you have this ancestor figure in many texts in African American literature and African American narratives. And I'm just wondering what you both think about that.
Yeah.
Magical Negro, the ancestor, or
okay.
brings the magic.
I'm getting excited now because I just, you know, I've been away from academia for a minute, and the writing that I do now is a little bit different. But you know, my master's thesis was on Clyde in Faulkner, Absalom, and Morrison's The Song of Solomon, because in that novel, in Absalom, Clytemnestra, she's acting as this catalyst for so much. She represents in so many ways, you know, slavery and the results of slavery, in terms of the fact that, you know, I feel like I'm not really giving very much away, but, you know, one of her parents was her master, essentially, you know, and thinking about like what that means and how that bleeds into this larger legacy, but how Quentin comes back again and again and again to this image of Clyde burning in that house. So if you haven't read this, it's like all kind of disconnected, and I'm sorry. But the Clyde definitely has this magical part in her. And so what I did in that thesis, I looked at Clyde in Faulkner and Pilate in Morrison in the Song of Solomon, because Pilate is the ancestor. And so, you know, I made this argument that, like, you know, that people have to come to terms with the ancestor in order to like learn more about who they were. And that for Quentin, Clyde was an ancestor, even though, you know, he was a white character, but coming into contact with her, she was this ancestor, but it was a very different dynamic because she was still always subservient to him. She wasn't his equal. And Pilot was this character that was mysterious. You know, she didn't have a belly button, etc. There was all of this power that was associated with her. I'm sorry. I'm babbling. Can I come back to this Flannery O'Connor, and then I'm going to kick it back to you, Don?
Yeah. I was going
because
to. You sound like you're talking about Beloved as well. You know.
Yeah.
Representation of the ghosts of slavery. She's literally the aftermath and the embodiment of that experience.
Yeah. I wrote my undergrad thesis on Beloved, and I looked at her as that character, as like this embodiment of the sublime. This, you know, this tension between that heaviness, that history, that sort of Gothic history, but then also what she represents as this way of freedom and moving beyond.
That they must now deal with in their present.
Right.
Us. You know, we're dealing with the ghost of slavery in 2020. We are dealing with it heavily. And, you know, we're dealing with our beloved, and we haven't really did anything about it, you know. So.
Yeah. No. Well, yeah. Well, we've done some interesting things, I think, but not enough.
That section, if you could, and I do want to come back to this because I think it also shows up in contemporary speculative fiction.
Yes. Yes. Because I'm thinking about Stephen King in The Stand.
Well, I'm not reading Stephen King, but, but I'm thinking,
Abigail.
You know, Butler. I'm thinking about this book that I'm just in love with by Akwaeke Emezi called Pet. Dread Nation by Justina Ireland. All of these stories where you have these Black girls or Black identified girl characters who are there to kind of save the day, you know, a similar kind of cultural work, labor that's being performed by these characters.
We were tired of saving the damn day.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you think about Kindred, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even in Butler's work, Kindred, like, and well, I want to talk about too much of that, but there's this thin line between the heroine and the person who is doing all the labor. Because I think about Parable of the Sower, Butler, with Laura, and what she has to do.
And they come back damaged. I mean, in Kindred, you know, she's going back and she's saving her white ancestor and simultaneously saving herself, but doesn't she lose her arm?
That's like the first scene, right?
Yeah, like in that text, she loses her arm. Or you think about Lauren Olamina in Parable of the Sower, and just all of the harm that she experiences because of her hyper empathy.
So I got a question. So when it comes to like Black women writers, especially when they give us the representation of Black women, they do place upon them a lot of burdens, right? That perhaps they're expensive. So do you, especially as Black women, think that is an agreeable representation, that the burden that Black women have to deal with in American society? I'm thinking about Alice Walker's work, for instance. I'm thinking about, as you two are talking about this burden that Black women have to deal with, we can, of course, go and talk about the trope of the suffering Black woman as well. That's a constant trope that's been relitigated, not only from white authors about Black people, but also Black men authors. They rely on sometimes the trope of the suffering Black woman. And that comes up. But my question to you two, Gale, I know you are the moderator, right? But do you feel that
I told you to jump in.
that representation is fair, you know, because that burden that exists on these Black female characters often in fiction?
I think it's difficult. And, you know, thinking about my work on Black and Latinx girls, in particular Black girls, I'm looking at ways in which they are given, the authors invest them with a sense of agency. They want to show these young characters are not to be dismissed. They have ideas, they're critical thinkers, and in many ways they are able to understand how power is operating in our society, how injustice is working. They're able to envision community in a different kind of way than adult characters are. And so there is the sense that they have kind of a pathway towards liberation for us all, right? But that's a heavy load for any one character to carry, and especially these young characters that are in the body of these young Black and by extension Latinx girls, you know, like to save the world. Is this Black girl magic again? Another just iteration of you know, the magical Negro swooping in.
Yes, I mean, I would say yes. And I have a few examples that are kind of anecdotal that if we have time at the end, I can share. But I'll just say yes. I do have this section ready.
Okay, go for it.
Okay.
Everything that rises must converge.
Yeah, and so Julian gets on this bus, and he, you know, makes it a point to sit by a Black person because he knows that that's going to make his mom upset. And so then, you know, and she's saying things that are kind of offensive. You know, I'm not going to say exactly what she says, but
because it is offensive.
Yeah, you know, and she says things like, you know, and I remember the old D word, who was my nurse, Caroline. There was no better person in the world. I've always had a great respect for my colored friends, she said. And then says, you know, will you, for God's sake, get off the subject, Julian said. When he got on the bus by himself, he made it a point to sit down beside a Negro in reparation, as it were, for his mother's sins. And then a couple of pages over, so one of the things that happens is his mom has on this ridiculous hat, and he talks about like how ridiculous it is. And then a few pages over, he tries to sort of like have this connection with the Black man that he's sitting by. So it says, like, you know, do you have a light? He asked the Negro. Without looking away from his paper, the man reached in his pocket and handed him a packet of matches. Thanks, Julian said. For a moment, he held the matches foolishly. A no smoking sign looked down upon him from over the door. This alone would not have deterred him had he had no cigarettes. You know, he's just trying to make his mom mad. And then a couple of pages over, we have this moment of this woman getting on the bus, this Black woman getting on the bus, and she has the exact same hat on as his mom. And so like that's like this moment of sort of like revelation or whatever. And so, you know, the vision of the two hats, identical, broke upon him with the radiance of a brilliant sunrise. His face was suddenly lit with joy. He could not believe that fate had thrust upon his mother such a lesson. He gave a loud chuckle so that she would look at him and see that he saw. She turned her eyes on him slowly. The blue in them seemed to have turned a bruised purple. For a moment, he had an uncomfortable sense of her innocence, but it lasted only a second before principle rescued him. Justice entitled him to laugh. His grin hardened until it said to her as plainly as it were, as he were saying aloud, your punishment exactly fits your pettiness. This should teach you a permanent lesson. And in this, the Black woman has a child with her, and his mother, the white woman, tries to give the child like a penny, and the Black woman's like, don't you take that, you know, like you don't need to take that penny from that white lady. And that ends up having this like moment of reckoning with his mother's health. Like, I mean, she basically like has a heart attack or something. We don't really know what happens to her, but sorry, that was like kind of a long passage to read.
But I want John to respond, to weigh in on this, because I haven't read the story in a very, very long time. What do you think, if you do, that O'Connor does well?
I think
representation of Black people.
I think O'Connor takes at the center of her context are white people, and there's some information that came out that kind of showed that O'Connor herself held some racist beliefs. But one of the things that she does do well in her literature, which I guess one can still do something good in the literature, is paint the absurdity and the sickness that is racism in the South. And she uses two characters who think that they both are right in terms of race problems in the South, when they're both are wrong, but to divergent degrees. So the mother is overtly racist. She says things that no one should say in any regard, even in the 1950s when the text takes place. Right, but Julian, on the other hand, he's secretly racist. He's the person who grows up to become a judge. He's the person who grows up to become a United States senator. These implicit biases that he has continues to contribute to the absurdity in the sickness of the South, and that is racism. And I think O'Connor does a really good job of trying to chart out that sickness as a through line, if you will, throughout her fiction. I love it. Rises must converge. Listen, I know O'Connor said some racist shit, but we can still teach that short story.
It is a really good story. And I think it's nice that you pointed out. It's like they both think that they're right? They both think that they're, enlightened or whatever. Because she says, the person who was her nurse, the Black woman who was her nurse, was the nicest person in the world. She was serving her. That was her job, right? And then her son is like, oh, I'm going to sit down next to this Black person to make my mom mad and then ask him for a light when I don't even have any damn cigarettes. It's so stupid.
O'Connor gives agency to the smoking sign. You saw that quickness, how she does that? She gives agency. The smoking sign look down upon him. She's very good with playing with language in that particular way of giving agency to items that are tangible but are inanimate. They don't have a thought process, but they speak so much more, when you actually look at it in the context of how she's writing about it.
And I think that's probably also sort of bringing with it the power of Jim Crow, right? These signs denoting spaces where Black bodies can be or Black bodies can't be, and where white bodies can be. And I think that, maybe I'm reading into this, too much, but I do think it's kind of calling out the fact that a lot of the things that rule the way that we interact are these unwritten, inanimate things.
These markers.
Yeah, or they're written, but they're inanimate, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Well, I want to, Jameela, you said something earlier about not all Black people live in the South or from the South or, attend Baptist church or what have you. And so I want us to get into the things that either get on your nerves or rub you the wrong way. And I'm thinking about space in particular because I feel like we go through these shifts in literature or just in the literary world in general with Black writers in terms of where Black stories are situated. And one of the things that gets on my nerves presently is that I feel like there aren't as many stories of Black people in rural spaces and in natural spaces, that every Black story is not a story that's centered in New York, DC, Atlanta, these major metropolitan areas, which of course we know we exist in these spaces. We migrated to, we continue to live and thrive in many of those spaces, but that's not the only representation of the reality of Black life. So
yeah,
what
I want to say this just real quick. This is kind of anecdotal, and then Dawn, you can come in with the real stuff. But when I went to college in New Mexico at UNM, and I had this visiting assistant professor for one of my first English classes, and that class was sort of a disaster for many reasons. And this visiting assistant professor was a white German woman, and I hadn't said very much in that class at all. I feel like I hadn't said anything in that class. I was the only Black person in that class, and I felt, very, I think a lot of us felt very unwelcome, because this woman was kind of not she was anti-American, and she was kind of racist. It was an interesting kind of feeling to be on the end of that. And we read Sonny's Blues. Say what?
What?
You should be mad at her because she's racist or anti-American. What way
Oh,
did you go with
it was just very awkward. I mean, it was weird. We were like, well, you came here, okay? So, and she was teaching American literature, and so it was like we read Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin, and she just decided to call on me, and I had never said anything in the class before, and she said, oh, she like looked and she was like, well, you tell me what did you think when you read this story? And I was so shocked. And it was funny because the white people in the class looked like, oh my God, like you called her out because she's the only Black person in here. And this is the first story we read by a Black person. And they were like, oh my gosh. And like, and some of them were kind of like whispering like, I'm so sorry. Because I was like shocked. I was like, what am I supposed to say? And so my answer was, she asked me some like, what do you think? Like, how can you relate to this or whatever? And I said, I don't know. I can't relate to it because I'm not from the city. And I just left it at that.
Yeah.
And that wasn't necessarily true. It wasn't necessarily untrue, but I felt so called out in that moment that there was this assumption that, I could relate to this because of course I had to been from, the inner city or whatever. It was an interesting moment, but I digress.
Don, I'm curious how you feel about this since you are from Mississippi in my Crooked Letter.
You never get any, there are so few people, and of course we remember our great Randall King, but there are so few writers that actually talk about rural South.
Yeah.
I should say a rural life for Black people in this country, and ideally, the bulk of us, a lot of us are still in rural places, Mississippi and even here in North Carolina, and that particular absence is, is biting. But I want to add one more to that. I remember I first started writing short stories because I never saw gay Black people in the 19th century, and the ideal that there were no gay Black people, even at this, chaotic, horrific time during slavery, post-slavery, of course, during the, convict leasing era, Jim Crowism, or what have you. But of course, we exist then. And Homegoing, I'm going to cite a book here, Steve. Homegoing by Yagiasi here. There's a piece that I think she, I don't know, knowingly, perhaps unknowingly does, that captures the essence of that kind of, erasure in African-American literature when it comes to gay Black people. She's writing about Quay in the 18th century. He's in West Africa. His father's a British man. His mother is a Black woman. And this is what I'm gonna read a little bit, if I may. Jameela, you read, so I get to read too. So
claim your time.
my time. So here it is. Within seconds, Cudjoe was on top of him, panting heavily while Quay struggled to turn him over. Quay knew he should tap the ground 3 times, the signal to end the match, but he didn't want to. He didn't want Cudjoe to get up. He didn't want to miss the weight of him. Slowly, Quay relaxed his body and he felt Cudjoe do the same. The boys drank in each other's gazes, their breathing slowed, the feeling on Quay's lip grew stronger, a tingling that threatened to draw his face up towards Cudjoe. Get up right now. James, the father, came into the room. That's that feeling, that moment that we especially as far as gay people who are reading Homegoing in this particular text, was like, here it is. These 2 men who love each other, who are into each other, are about to kiss. The author, I think, in all of her power, because she's like omnipotent in this case, she's her God, like Edward P. Jones said, he gets to be God in his text. She throws in that kind of historical erasure there. It's invisible. Never comes back to it. I appreciate that she does touch upon that in this particular text, but of course that entire experience is not within, it's not as far as people retelling the history, if you will, it's not included. And I think that's one of the things that frustrates me the most. And that's one of the reasons why I've tried to take up writing short stories of my own, perhaps in the same vein of Toni Morrison, is if you want to read something that hasn't been written, you have to
write it. Yeah.
You have to write your own. I'm wondering how you feel about language, because I know one of the things that gets under my skin is when writers try to replicate Black speech. And I've mentioned this before to you, so I know you both kind of know how I feel about this. And I don't know, I just feel there's something so intimate about language and the connection to language and culture, and that you just have to handle it so carefully. So if I'm reading something, and this can also be with a Black writer, but if I'm reading something and suddenly it's representing, whether you want to call it Ebonics, African American vernacular English, what have you, and the language starts to look different. I mean, it's one thing to have expressions in a text that can kind of pinpoint this is the time and space that we're in, and we're in this, you know, Black community in Atlanta in the 1980s or whatever it may be. It's another thing when it seems to be a signal for the character's Blackness, and the language is like totally falling apart. Like it's ungrammatical, you're splitting verbs, you're you know, cutting off letters, this, that, and the other, in order to represent what you think Black people sound like. And I think it's difficult. And you know, both of you write, and I write as well, and I feel like I have a good ear for sound and for language, and I just feel like it's really, really difficult, and it's something that writers should take just great care with.
I think if they do it well, like Zora Neale Hurston, for instance, then
Yes.
us Black folk are gonna be like, now wait a minute, what's this? Because I mean, she captured the essence of a person's, because that's what she did as an anthropologist. You know, that was her field of study, was capturing the rhetoric and the language of an individual. But there are so many people who try to do that. Even I think we perhaps have tried to do it, thinking that it would be the best way to tell a story before, and it just doesn't come out. It doesn't come across. You know, and so I think you should just use your language to tell the story, you know, and you should put it in a way that is going to be able to have these characters have full complexity about them, and they don't have to dip into some kind of fictionalized version of the vernacular that you think as a particular that they're going to represent. Like if you're writing a story, some random person from Wisconsin one day wants to write a story about his travels in Mississippi, it'd be very interesting to see how he captures, you know, how Black people talk in Mississippi, but you don't have to go into you know, as you were mentioning, Gail, all those problematic things, broken English, ungrammatical constructions, because African American vernacular is, you know, effective as it is, and it don't need any tinkering, you know. So.
Yeah, and there is a grammar there.
Exactly.
Yeah, that it just brought to mind something that I see happens a lot with a quotation from Beloved, and it's Paul D is at the end, and he's talking to Setha, and he says, you know, you your best thing.
This is my most favorite part of this novel. Oh my God, Jameela, you are in my brain. Seriously, it's one of my most favorite moments of that.
And there, but you know, there are so many quotations that I see out in the world from that scene that correct the grammar. And this actually happened recently, and I knew the account that posted it, and I said, hey, just so you know, this is not the right quotation. He does not say you are your best thing. He says you your best thing.
You your best thing. Exactly.
And I was like, and it's important there that, you know, we quote that true to form. And they corrected it. And, you know, and it's funny because I made a little argument and I took a picture of the text and I was like, I know that quote, you know? And so I think that that's an example of how a Black writer gets it right. Like him saying that in that moment, you can feel the intimacy there, you know, saying like, you know, like you your best thing, right? There doesn't need to be like, Setha, you are your best thing. Right. There's a totally different, you know, feel. And I think that it takes skill to do that effectively. And I will say I've encountered a lot of resistance from students over the years when I do teach things that have dialect. I've taught a lot of Charles Chestnut, and there are a couple of his pieces that are really heavy with a dialect. And, you know, I was teaching mostly, you know, kind of white affluent students at this one particular place. And they were like, I can't even read this. Like, I don't know what this means. And I encouraged them. I said, read it aloud. Like, don't try and read it in your head. Like, read it aloud and sound it out. And some of them did that and they were like, oh, like, I get it. It's just kind of like a Southern kind of accent. And, you know, there are most of them from the South and they connected with it in that way. But when they were so resistant, they were just kind of like, you know, like, they were sort of almost implying like, you know, this isn't even language. Like, why would somebody write this? And so I do think that there is power in dialect. There's power in like breaking down, you know, Queen's English or whatever. And there are ways that you can empower readers to encounter that in meaningful ways. And I think as a writer, if you're going to use dialect, like, you need to make sure that it is something that works when people speak it and sound it out. It needs to sound like, you know, people are talking.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. As a African American literature began through the oral tradition, right? Our ancestors in particular had way more faith in what could be communicated orally, which we get this powerful, beautiful vernacular. And I'm going to make a second claim. American English is African American English. Everything that African Americans have created around popular expressions, terms, how we say child and girl and all these things, right? This adds to the culture, you know, of this particular context and in this particular way. But Gail, I want to go back to your other question too. And I was going to say that The Color Purple is a great example of someone writing, I think, such a beautiful text that captures what you were talking about. In many cases, the vernacular with Celie's language and how she's talking, how she's communicating, perfectly fine, very effective. And then you get Steven Spielberg's movie. Not to say anything too bad about Steven Spielberg.
Yeah. Yeah, which is interesting because it is another Black Southern writer who's rooted in the culture, and to a certain extent, you know, we can say what we want to say about Oprah. Your fellow Mississippian.
Mississippian, you're right.
Exactly, right. But then what we see being translated on the screen is so dramatically different and doesn't ring true.
From the text. Yeah. And then I've seen the play as well on Broadway. And I mean, I think the play does a better job at trying to stick to the Alice Walker's original text. But of course, these things can be, you know, recreated and repurposed because they're different artists providing their own interpretation to it. But I think that's a very poignant example of how someone takes something that was written by, in this particular case, an African-American woman, and then they change it and completely, you know, messes up the context of the whole novel. And now you have people who want them to sing God's trying to tell you something in the play. And I'm like, no, that song is not in the book. Like, they're probably not going to include it in the play, you know.
But it's taken on a life of its own, right? You know, in pop culture.
You keep them separated, you know, which I would hate to find that at some high school in America, instead of actually teaching The Color Purple, someone is actually letting the students watch the movie. You know, in its place, which would be, you know, so bad, you know. Yeah.
Well, Jameela, you said several things earlier. I'm trying to figure out where to land, but speaking about Paul D and Setha and
That's
him,
your favorite quote, your favorite part of the book.
that favorite part of the book. I mean, I was thinking about like what stories are lacking. We can continue about what irks you or what you know, draws your ire and anger and all of that in terms of representations, but what stories do you want to see? And I think one of the things for me is just this constant perception of Blackness as being related to trauma or as a response or an identity to white supremacy and white racism. As if, and Morrison talks about this all the time, the white gaze, right? That Black people don't exist outside of this white gaze, when in fact we have vibrant culture and communities that may not always be accessible if you are not part of the community, but that is still rich and so complex. And so I'm thinking about the importance of love stories. And so that's why, you know, that's one of my favorite ones. And I'm also thinking, you mentioned Alice Walker and The Color Purple. And of course, we can talk about Celie, right? And her love relationship in that story, right? Or forbidden love relationship. But I'm also thinking about Alice Walker's third life of Grange Copeland. And
Okay, let me tell you something. That is on my bookshelf.
Really?
I have not read it, and I feel very guilty because
You got a PhD?
because Dr. James Coleman, you know, bless his soul, he insisted that I buy that book and read it.
Yeah.
And I bought it, and it's sitting right there. It's so funny. Like it like came out and it was like, you haven't read me, Jameela.
This is Dr. Coleman coming down and speaking to y'all. Everyone, so we lost two giants in African American letters, and specifically at UNC Chapel Hill, Dr. James Coleman, James W. Coleman, who wrote about faith, who wrote about John Edgar Wideman, everything Wideman's ever written a year ago, and then of course Randall Keenan most recently in August. But that novel, The Third Life of Grange Copeland, there's violence in it and obvious struggle, but at the same time, there's this relationship between the grandfather and his granddaughter that is so tender and it is so beautiful. It just moves me. I mean, it moves me anytime I read that text, and I don't revisit it often, but I feel like we need these stories. We need these stories.
Yes, and can I say something about Keenan and a story that I've taught many times because of its focus on intimacy? I feel like one of the stories we need are not only love stories between Black folks that don't have, it's not just soaked 100% in trauma, but especially with older Black women. Black women over 50, and I talk a little bit about this, I think, in some things that I do, but I highly recommend What Are Days in this is Let the Dead Bury Their Dead by Randall Keenan. And What Are Days is probably one of my favorite stories, if not my favorite story in this entire text. And it's because Keenan paints Lena in this way that is so lovely. Like, she is coming from a place of sort of like being in mourning, and you know, her husband of many years has passed on, and she's, you know, I think she's 52, and she runs into this young man who's sort of like kind of being fresh with her, and she's just like, is he for real? And they have this encounter. And one of the things that I do with my students is, well, I don't have any students anymore, but you know what I mean. But one of the things I used to do with them was have them read this long section of her body, of Keenan, you know, who was a gay Black man, describing the body of this woman in, you know, very intimate, sexual, like, terms that doesn't feel, what's the word, like, it doesn't feel exploitative, it doesn't feel inauthentic, it feels so incredibly real. And this little part, I'm not gonna read the whole thing, but I would make my students close their eyes and I would read this part to them. I'm just gonna read like the first couple of lines. He gave such attention to every part of her, and like the Tin Man, she felt remade, bit by bit, bite by bite. Her neck, which for so long she had thought too flabby and too full of folds, he licked, his saliva coating it with healing wet heat. He loved her new neck. Her breast, large, pendulous, melon-like, though she had never borne children, he kneaded and caressed and sucked, the nipples so large, pinched, nibbled. She adorned her new breast. And so thinking about like this moment of celebrating the woman's body as it is, you know, the over 50 body is so necessary and so needed, I think, in this moment, especially when we see like so many women who we just know have augmentations, right? Like it's really in right now to have the large breasts and the small waist and the large hips and the large ass. All of these things are like a part of like our moment. But there's also a space for, you know, women over 50, you know, menopausal women, perimenopausal women, etc., to celebrate their bodies. And I think for Black women, that is so important. And I'm really like, I want people to go and read the story.
I'm going to read it tonight. And I actually think, Jameela, that is not only an important story to tell of women in general, Black women specifically over a certain age, but Black women in general. And like I'm thinking of, because it's right in front of me, Elizabeth Acevedo, who is an Afro-Latina writer. It's a YA novel. And Xiomara, who is the main character in this story, she's voluptuous. And her body, you know, it gets all this attention, unwanted attention from guys that are just on her block, right? In her city, she's in New York. And so there's this hesitancy also because she's raised within a very Catholic Dominican household. There's this hesitancy to even be in her body, right? And I think that because of the experience of enslavement, because of rape, because of sexual trauma, that there's a lot that Black women have to contend with in terms of embracing that sexuality, that sexual side of ourselves, sexual expression.
I was going to mention, because we were talking about Alice Walker, right? Everyday use, I think, is a great text, right? And it's, you know, I think one of the things that we've perhaps landed on is that Black women tend to kind of get things right in their fiction.
Now,
and
this is one about the quilt.
Yes, this is the one about kids, and you know, of course, people can battle the story, but I've always taken the thesis of this story to be, what do we do with our heritage? How do we protect our heritage? And what we've traditionally seen is that a lot of Black women take up this work in so many ways because they carry on so many traditions. You know, whether it's quilt making, which is in this particular case, but also other things that we've done in our families. But anyway, I just think it's a beautiful story that goes along with what Jameela was saying. You have this older Black woman who represents this heritage for her family, and then you have the younger Black daughter who also represents this heritage for her family. So what happens when those two worlds collide? You know, it's kind of like I'm setting up a television show, right? But anyway, it's a great short story. It's a very easy to read. And Gale, again, she plays with figurative language, and she plays with the vernacular in this particular short story in such a way that I don't even think the fluent students I've taught it to actually noticed. You know, so captivated by the story that's been told because Alice Walker is just that good.
And that also reminds me of this, which I don't think gets read very much. It's called My Familiar.
And doesn't Celie's sister play a role in this novel? Or am I mistaken? I think that she actually takes one of the characters.
She does. Yeah. I can't, it's been a while since I've read it.
Yeah.
It is like sort of like I don't want to say it's a sequel, but it's almost sort of like thinking about like Beloved, Jazz, and Paradise with
But
Morrison.
It's a completely different narrative.
Yeah, because it goes Color Purple, Temple of My Familiar, and then Meridian, I think, maybe sort of in that order.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the Temple of My Familiar is a story about a lot of things, but there's a lot of sexual exploration. There's queerness is explored, queerness is normalized. Like, I mean, I feel like this is a book before its time in many ways. And I think that I feel like James Coleman is the one who recommended this book to me. And I did read this one. I bought it and I read it. And it was either him or Menrose, and I can't remember, but I think I read it in like a weekend. Yeah. But it's hot and heavy. It's
The Third Life of Grange Copeland is very beautiful too.
Walker doesn't get enough attention, I don't think.
You know, reading The Third Life of Grange Copeland for the first time was, I remember I wrote what the fuck. I wrote that in the book. You know, you know, perhaps you can reference why I'm saying that. When it came to Brownfield, you know, 'cause everyone rooted for Brownfield.
Yeah.
You know, how Alice Walker is able to give you such a character so full of complexity that you root for him in one page, then you hate him in the next.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so you read all of these, the 3 lives of Grange Copeland, if you will, you read all of them and you learn how to go through, because Alice Walker was all about this process of forgiving. How do we forgive? How do we grow as a family, as a community? And so you have to contend with that as you're reading her literature, whether it's The Third Life of Grange Copeland, whether it's The Color Purple with Cynthia Mister, whether it's Everyday Use with the daughter and the mom. You can't walk away from your problems. They're not going to fix it that way. And I think that Black women writers throughout throughout the African American literary tradition, sounds so scholarly when I say it that way, huh? But from Maria Stewart, I mean, go all the way back from the 19th century, she was standing at Franklin Lecture Hall in the 1830s telling white folks in the North that you're no better than white folks who were enslaving Black folks in the South. This is from a Black woman's mouth, right? And so you have these Black women who've been doing all of this burdened down work for so long that it's almost so natural for me to pick up Homegoing and be like, oh, I know this is going to be a good novel, right? You know, so yeah. I'm off my high horse.
I see you popping up, but I have one more question.
You go right ahead. You go right ahead.
If we have time for this, because, and then we can open it up for other questions. So we are in this moment of 2020, this hellacious year that it has been with the pandemic and with all of the violence against Black people and uprisings, rightfully so, against that. And so I'm just curious, with all these book lists circulating, what's on your pandemic or revolutionary reading list, or are you totally abandoning those and doing something else, gravitating towards something else?
I got some examples for you, and they're not even anywhere related to anything that we've been talking about. They do have Black people in it though. So this is the Walking Dead comics. And so I've gone, I know I'm jumping ship here. They do have Black people in the Walking Dead, and they are multidimensional characters, even though the writers are white. But it's, you know, it's, I don't know, something else to think about in a different world. And then of course, again, as Steve introduced me, my nerd alert, and then I've been reading the Avatar, The Last Emperor, in the comics as well. Completely outside, you know, of our reality. And so it kind of helps me wind down a little bit, you know.
It is completely outside of my perception of you, because I know how rooted you are. I mean, Don is ride or die for early Black writer. Like 19th century, 18th century, that's his, you know, his world, his realm. So you surprised me. How about you, Jameela?
I was going to add, because it was so much going on, Gail. So I'm writing about Venture Smith, and I'm writing about Phyllis Wheatley, and I'm saying the same silence and the same violence that they endured. It is a damn shame that I'm still having to endure this. It's a shame that when I go jogging, I see a placard in a neighborhood store that says Black Lives Matter. That's me. Someone has to post a sign and say that my life is important, that my life matters to somebody white, that I perhaps know dying one day, I'm going to die one day knowing that my Black skin didn't matter. But in these comics, you know, I get to kind of step away from that in such a way that I don't have to live it in the lived reality of my own experience, and also in the historical, you know, work that I do. You know, it's a break.
Yeah, a necessary break. How about you, Jameela? What are you reading?
It's complicated because it's like I feel like a lot of my life is filled with news and listening to podcasts and stuff. I mean, I think, you know, for me, I often go to pleasure. I was gonna mention Nikki Finney's new text, like hotbed of occasional. I can't remember the whole, because it's I can't reach it, but it's her newest book.
Steve, can you find it?
Steve, can you do the magic? It's
I can do it.
Something.
And Nikki Finney is speaking, I think, at the Kentucky Book Festival in November. It should be virtual, so you can buy your books from Scuppernong. Check her out.
And the cool thing about Nikki Finney, you know, is that she's doing some things that I would love to do in terms of like hybrid work. Nikki Finney's doing that. Alexis Gomes is doing that.
Always.
You know, there are a lot of these folks who are doing these hybrid works that I want to do myself, because, you know, it's like being a poet who's also, you know, been through the rigor of what we, you know, get, our PhDs, our dissertations, whatever, right? Like that, it's like you want to, I want to marry those two and then have them have a conversation and put them out in the world in a way that is accessible to folks. So I've been reading her book. I've also have been kind of dancing a little bit with Keenan's last text, 2 Wings.
I haven't ordered it yet.
If I Had 2 Wings, and a collection of short stories. And I've also I lost somebody earlier this year, so I've been reading. This is kind of like totally left field, but a couple of books about, like, you know, ideas about what happens after we die by Sherry Dillard, who is actually a Durham resident. And so one of the books I'm reading is I'm Still With You. So yeah, it's been a summer. It's been a year.
It has been. And I'll just end by saying that what's on my nightstand now is this book, Black Imagination, curated, not written by, but curated by Natasha Marin, who is a conceptual artist. And this is just a collection of writings about imagining a future where Black people are free, where we are healthy, where we are whole. There are contributions by kids, by folk who are incarcerated, by Black queer writers, Black elders. I mean, everybody and their mama thinking about what can we envision 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What does the future look like? What does it hold for Black people where we can be healthy and safe? And what'd you say?
Futuristic text almost.
Yeah, futuristic text and experimental text. I think there was an exhibition that might have jumped off this idea for her, and it went viral, and she just decided she wanted to do something with that. So I'm spending a lot of time reading texts related to Black folk and healing, and Black love, Black joy, because I feel like we need that in this space right now. And the one thing I will say, because I showed this earlier, Pet, that the main character in the story is a Black trans girl, but this is not the center of the story. She's at the center, but that's not the center of the novel. But it is about reckoning and how do we deal with harm and violence in our communities in a way that is that holds people accountable and that allows us to feel that some justice has been done. And again, it's this young Black girl character who's at the center of it. So the whole idea back to how much are they holding, how much are they moving us forward, how much are we relying upon them for our future. But it's a refreshing read, I should say. A refreshing read.
That wraps you up and hooks you, that kind of read.
Exactly. Steve, I'm looking at you. Do we have questions?
I don't know. Let's see if we have questions or comments. There is one further up the list. Is Black girl magic just another iteration of the magical Negro trope? And does it depend on who's invoking it?
And I saw that question. I think Melly asked it. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question because, again, if I'm thinking about Toni Morrison and thinking about the ancestor role in our text, she's writing about Black writers, writing about, this ancestor figure who is giving you some wisdom, who is kind of showing you the light and the error of your ways and dropping some knowledge here and there so that you can, make some wise decisions or have some sense of self-awareness. And Akwaeke Emezi is a Black writer, obviously Octavia Butler and Lauren Olamina. And so I don't know if it's something I think we have to grapple with.
Or is it that the difference is, it's kind of like what I think about it, Gail, in conjunction to Mila's question, is that it's kind of like leaning dependent on the ancestors, right? You look towards the ancestors for guidance and towards that. That's what I get when I think about it in terms of when it comes to Morrison and the use of the ancestors, at least from in my perspective, in the use of the ancestors. So it doesn't seem in this sense kind of superhero-y, right? They come in, they swoop in, and they tell you something that's so profound. And they kind of, what was that movie Eddie Murphy did, Mr. Church or something? And they come in and they do
Oh gosh, yeah.
so profound, and that changes everything, right? Whereas in this one, like for instance, when I took my exams, I prayed to my ancestors. I thought about them, and I pressed upon them to give me the strength to get through this particular hurdle, you know. And so, I don't know. I think about it in that regard. I don't know if that's explicative or helpful, but yeah.
I think it's similar to the strong Black woman kind of trope or narrative as well. So what are ways in that it's affirmative and also damaging or limiting at the same time?
We didn't talk about the suffering Black woman trope, which Douglas used. So many important, I shouldn't say important, but many Black writers have used that particular trope in order to advance a story, because that was they saw their mothers and their grandmothers suffering in silence, for instance, because people sometimes don't think no one is watching. And then these people grow up to be writers, and that same trope comes out in their work, I think inadvertently in many cases, what the suffering Black woman that is.
Yeah, because that also brings to mind the tragic mulatta, you have that with Chestnut and House Behind the Cedars. You've got that with Nella Larson and Passing. And that's another one of those tropes that
I'm so you mentioned that brought so much joy to my heart.
It still gets repeated.
Because you mentioned that, Jameela, and this is a middle grade novel called Genesis Begins Again. And she actually came, Alicia D. Williams is the writer. I don't remember where she's originally from. Steve, I don't know if you remember, but she teaches middle school, I think, middle or elementary school in Charlotte now. And it's a novel about colorism, which, we talk about in Black communities all the time. I think it surfaces, definitely in pop culture, on reality TV, on, talk shows, podcasts, etc. And I haven't really seen too many writers really dealing with it for younger audiences. And so this one, it's an interesting treatment and definitely breaks outside of that whole tragic mulatto kind of, narrative, but the story focuses on Genesis, who is a young girl who's dark skinned, and how she contends with that. And her mother is very light skinned. So they're grappling with this within their family. And she's also dealing with this reality out, in her day-to-day life in school. Interesting.
That brings to mind, Morrison, because she looks at those issues in more than one of her novels. One of them that I'm more familiar with is Paradise, right? Where, the first line is that, they shot the white girl first, but it's about the whole community of, I can't remember the name of the community. It's not Silk, because that's from Love, which I wrote about. I can't remember the name of the community that's in Paradise, but Paradise, the whole concept is about colorism and what that does.
And I think it also addresses it in Sula as well.
What about The Bluest Eye? Is that part of The Bluest Eye?
Yeah, I think to a degree, The Bluest Eye, and then also, what is it? Is it Home? Is it Home that does it? That looks at it as well, I think, right?
Yeah.
God Save the Child. Is that it?
God Save the Child. That's it. Yeah, God Save the Child, and then Paradise looks at a whole community where if you aren't a dark-skinned person, you can't even be there. And that's why Paradise is this sort of alternate community that takes in these other folks. I won't give it away, because Paradise is definitely like a mystery kind of novel in a sense. And a lot of people have trouble getting through it, but
I know you
recommend it.
I'll say Recess Teeth, she takes all of that shit away, and you remember the short story Recess Teeth? like only one of her, she only wrote like what, one short
Mm-hmm.
story?
Mm-hmm. I think it might have been the only one, actually.
Only one, and she literally, boom, it's gone. There are no identifiers. So you have to try to get through that story by assigning race yourself, if you want to, I guess, you know. It's a short story.
So I want to give people in the audience a chance to ask a question. We have a few minutes left, so you can unmute yourself and talk, or you can type it into chat. We've got a few more minutes left. Yes, Gwen.
So Gwen, great job, folks. I just wanted to, actually, I was already thinking to ask this question, and the last point you made flows right into it. The question is, because we're talking about literature, which, you know, it's words on a page, that idea of the imagination and how you're picturing people and whether or not you're assigning race or certain levels of color or identities to people based on your readership versus what the author is instilling, and kind of where that mix happens in the process of reading these various authors. And I'll give you a little background. One reason I have this come to mind, it was this really kind of huge moment for me in college when I was first reading Octavia Butler, and the cover of the book actually had the characters were white. So there was nothing to tell you that this was by a Black author. But then if you didn't have that cover to inform your perception of who the characters were, and you just read the book, every description if you just had read it cold, you presumably should be led to portraying, you know, an African-American woman, but the cover, you know, was going to mess with your mind. And then if you're bringing your own assumptions, that would also perhaps show how you're portraying the characters in your own mind. So that kind of reader perceptions when race is not necessarily explicit, or maybe the author thinks it's explicit, but how the reader might make their own assumptions.
Or sometimes the author is trying to deliberately play with those assumptions, because
right.
about Butler just constantly wanting diverse categories, whether it's around race, whether it's around gender, age, ability, all of these things. But at the same time, then, you know, we also have a history of book covers not necessarily being representative. I'm thinking of Julia Alvarez's novel. I don't remember, oh gosh, it's set in the Dominican Republic, but the first edition, Jameela, I don't know if you remember this, but the first edition had like a bouquet of flowers on the front. And there was a lot that was tragic in terms of what was happening politically and with racialized communities in the DR at that time. And yet this book cover, you know, was a very nice arrangement of some flowers. So, you know, how does that impact what the reader expects as they enter the text?
I like this idea that Gwen mentioned, though, is the ideal of picturing people, right? So, for instance, it made me think about what comes to your mind when you sit down to write something about your day, for instance, and you say, I'm going to describe everyone I saw. So I used to have students do this, and I have them go out and people watch. And every time they saw someone of color, they would mention it. But every time they saw someone white, I assumed they a male student walked by, a female student walked by. There was no racial identifier. And I think that that particular picturing process is already, perhaps has been pre-exposed to us because of the structures of our society. We grow up in a society indoctrinated to see people based on their racial identifiers. And as Morrison, we talked about Morrison at length this evening, Morrison said that one of the big issues in society is that white people don't believe that they have a race, or that they don't believe that they are also raced within a particular society. And so much so that they, when we imagine people and we write about people, we write about them exactly how our brain is wired to think about them. And then we have to pull out and read it and say, oh, this is problematic, or okay, this is unfair, or what have you, you know, whatever conclusions you arrive. But no, I really like that idea of going, picturing people and what does that look like in our minds. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And for writers, you know, in particular, in literature.
Yeah.
And the other big example is the whole concept of Hermione, you know, and, you know, and that was one that kind of made headlines, but I'm sure there's other examples too of kind of reclaiming or situating characters in different ways. So I'll let y'all.
Harry Potter with Hermione, when the black girl played her. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Okay. When Hermione was Black, and all of the outrage from readers who felt like this was just unimaginable. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole nother can of worms I'm not going to get into. But I will say that there was one story when I taught Welty. So Welty has a story named Clytie, and I taught that story a lot. It's a short story, and I think it's in A Curtain of Green. And there's a character in the story that I ask my students, I said, you know, like, okay, so Clytie, is she Black? Is she white? Like, what's up with her family? You know, how do you imagine her family? And there's this one scene in the text where it describes her lips as being black or like dark. And it's an interesting thing, because a lot of times when students first read this text, they assume that Clytie is a Black woman. And her name's Clytie Farr, and the story takes place in Forest Gin. And I have them sort of break it down, and I basically ask them, like, you know, like, how many small towns in the South before our current era do you know that are named after Black people or Black families? And they're kind of like, oh, I don't know. And, you know, the way that Clytie is described, there's a question, but she is a white woman, you know, and she's from a family that was fairly wealthy at one point in time. And so I do think it's really interesting to think about how people imagine characters, because there'll be like one sort of, you know, description, but out of context, they might see it as a different, and they might take it in a different way. And Clytie is one of those ones that several students have thought that they were reading about a Black family.
Yeah.
They had been talking about a Black family.
It reminds me of Bitter in the Mouth, Monique Song. And that story, I won't give it away for everybody, but I think it's read in a way where you can be totally in left field in terms of identifying this character racially, ethnically, and then come to find out that, my perception was completely off base.
So before we close for the evening, is there one more question floating out there? One more burning question that someone might have? You can type it into chat, or you can unmute yourself.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. I'm on my little computer tablet thing. It plugged into the, I don't know, auxiliary situation. I can't see anything. So, okay, awesome.
Thank you.
This has been so beautiful. Thank you so much. Really, I've been thinking a lot today about the magical Negro and thinking about flight and like what is magic and all of this. So thanks, Melly, for that question too. And my question for y'all is, in light of what you have said about the stories that need to be told, particularly about Black love, because I think it's almost never works out, which I was really disappointed at in Watchmen. So could you maybe speak to some of the Black magic that we're seeing on television and how these stories are being adapted into the media world with Watchmen in particular, and also Lovecraft
I knew you were gonna say that.
I haven't seen either one, so.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Okay.
I kind of feel a little ashamed because it's all in, everyone at the tip of everyone's mind,
Yeah.
and I haven't been digging into that. I will say though, in terms of media perceptions or depictions of Black love, I've been, like I said, rewatching Girlfriends and have just been pissed that Joan's character is constantly seeking this love ship relationship and is constantly falling short of it. It was one of my critiques of the shows Shonda Rhimes with the presidency.
Oh, Scandal. Oh.
Yes, like, can she ever be in a successful
Horrible.
Black love relationship, right? Like, do we have depictions of Black love on screen, in text, what have you, that people can draw upon?
Yeah.
It is so frustrating. And so I'll say this. So I have not seen Scandal, but I have seen Lovecraft Country and Watchmen.
Okay.
And I was very disappointed with
Ooh.
Watchmen and Lovecraft Country. I mean, I'm so freaking sick of sacrifice, being the ticket to it's like, why do we have to sacrifice for the larger community? Why can't we have something lovely and beautiful for an indefinite amount of time? Like, why does there have to be a finite time limit to it? And I'm thinking about Lovecraft Country in this sense. And it's very frustrating. And and it's like, and I don't know why this is a continual thing that we come to again and again. And I feel like, queer folks probably also like feel some type of way, right? About how in so many relationships on screen with queer couples, there's some sort of awful ending. They can't be together unbothered. I hope that I feel like I'm probably, I'll say spoiler alert, in terms of something that just came out on Netflix, Ratchet. So I'll just say that, like, there is an element of that in terms of queer love, where it's like, can't we have, can't people have anything? Can't Black people have anything? Can't queer people have anything that is lasting? And then I'm kind of like, oh, well, I mean, sure, like, there's straight couples, there's, white couples that don't have a happily ever after. So maybe this is a part of, being.
Every narrative.
Say what?
Every narrative is an unhappy, kind of, chaotic situation.
Yeah, it just seems like there's a kind of a preponderance of that in terms of, Black folks and queer folks. And I wish it was a different situation.
So, I was going to mention the photograph with Issa Rae and Lakeith Stanfield.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's such a very beautifully done movie. I love patient films like Moonlight. The filmmaker isn't rushing to get through it. They want to be very methodical as they tell you the story. And the photograph is just one of those brilliantly told, stories that has love at the end. And it's so beautiful. So, yeah.
Okay. I thank you for that. And I mean, I think Issa's doing a lot of work in that realm with trying to really show Black love and Black love hanging around until the end, or being able to come back. I wonder how much of it's based on folks' idea of realism and like what's real, like trying to depict what is real. And I think that's very sad, especially in a time when more than ever, maybe we need imagination. So
yes.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. This is really interesting. Thank you so much. I'm going to watch it again.
We all got to go and write Black love stories, y'all.
That's it. Can I write a love story? I don't think I can, Gail. I don't think I have the vocabulary.
No, but see, it's interesting that you're questioning that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know.
It's not a possibility.
So I do want to say, you know, we've done 3 of these, one on women, one on the LGBTQ folks, and one on Black folks. And the idea of trauma-centered narratives has annoyed everyone. This idea that everything has to be a trauma, the idea that everyone has to suffer for their marginalized status, whatever that marginalized status is, and that no one, you know, if you do gradually reach a happy ending, you have to suffer so much to get there. And I just wonder if you have any ideas of where that comes from, not just for Black folks, but for marginalized communities. And is it some way that the larger society either, I don't know, elevates people in that community as martyrs or presses them down as people who can't make it work? I don't know which it is.
I don't know if I got your entire question because I was responding to Don in the chat.
It's just that the trauma-centered narratives are across the board what people in these events have complained about, regardless of what their marginalized community is. Mm. And I'm just wondering if you have any ideas about why that seems to be such a necessity, why the larger society feels that a trauma narrative is what works, or what sells, or what is what people want to hear in regards to these folks who are, yeah.
I think for me, I think it's a very practical answer. That's how it all started. It started out with, you know, a white person finding, and Black people in our particular case story, and communicating. I should specify here, Black folk had been communicating in multiple languages well before English was even a language. Let me just say that. But in terms of writing and speaking and signifying in the English language, it started with the product of you putting your trauma on display so that people can understand your struggles and your circumstances, so that we can fight against the institution of slavery. And that, of course, you know, continue to evolve over the years. But I think that part of that kind of foundation, that process that white raiders, the dominant culture, have been reading about Black people, has been so ingrained in our society for so long, that when there is a story that doesn't have that traumatic ending, or it doesn't have that suffering Black woman in it, or a magical Negro, that sometimes white people don't know what to do with it, you know? And it was just a beautiful love story that was just told about these two entities that fell in love with each other. So I think in that particular case, it comes from a very historical, you know, foundation.
I think it also relates, though, Jameela, I'm looking at you thinking about playing in the dark, because you mentioned that earlier, Toni Morrison playing in the dark, and the idea that one of the things that grounds American literature is this conception of the American as white that's based off of comparing it to this Black Africanist presence. And so if you have these trauma narratives, if you're stripping people of color and other marginalized communities of their humanity, it's a very effective way of othering. It's a very effective way of maintaining your position of power and control. It's useful.
Yep, it is. That's all I gotta say about it.
Yeah,
Melly said this is a whole nother conversation. It
really all the time when Black students have to write, you know, personal letters to get in college. Well, you know, write about where's your dad? Is your dad not there? You can write about that. You know, people love to read about that particular trauma, and particularly how we overcame it. You know, people love, oh, you're going to get your PhD. No one in your family has a college education, but it doesn't mean that my family didn't support me, you know, and that they didn't love me and didn't give sacrifice for me. So you don't want to talk about that aspect. You just want to talk about the suffering, the traumatic experiences along the way, you know.
Yeah.
Carla Holloway would call it a knowable narrative of Blackness.
A knowable narrative of Blackness.
Like, this is what we expect.
Yep.
Gale, Don, Jameela, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming and having this conversation. It's been really amazing. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Jameela. Thank
This
you,
was
Don,
really fun.
for
Yeah.
joining. Thank you, everyone who popped in. I see some names of folk that I recognize and some new folk too. So I appreciate your presence.